Well, welcome everybody to the final seminar of the IHR History of Sexuality series. I'm really pleased that Charles Upchurch has joined us today to speak for our closing event of the year. Charles Upchurch is an associate professor of British history at Florida State University. He received his PhD from Rutgers University in 2003, and his research focuses on 19th century British gender and social history. His book, Before Wild, Sex Between Men in Britain's Age of Reform, was published in 2009 by the University of California Press and explores the ways in which family and class influenced the interpretation of same-sex desire in the period between 1820 and 1870, a much neglected period, as many of us know. Professor Upchurch's current book project investigates a group of men linked to the British Parliament who attempted to reduce the penalties for homosexual acts in the 1820s. He's just published articles in Gender and History, the Journal of Social History, and the Journal of History of Sexuality. I think it's this work that he'll be speaking to us about today. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much. And just to let everybody know, the talk comes in right at about 40 minutes, right? And it's going to outline most of the key ideas for the next book. So some things I'm going to move through fairly quickly, just in the interest of time and letting you see sort of the shape of the whole argument, and can fill in any gaps in the Q&A that follows at the end. All right? So, now, central to my next book, as Justin said, is an attempt to make sense of something that, on the face of it, I'm not supposed to be finding from my period or my place. That is, at least a small group of individuals motivated by same-sex desire, making arguments based on the idea that same-sex desire was both inborn and natural, and using this as a way to challenge the British sodomy laws in the 1820s, 30s, and 1840s. Specifically, these individuals were arguing for elimination of the death penalty for sodomy in the period when the British Parliament was drastically reducing the use of the death penalty throughout the English criminal law. These individuals had an insider's knowledge of Parliament and its members, and at least in their own account, they were addressing their arguments to both the Lords and the Commons. Also, in addition to invoking the idea that same-sex desire was inborn and central to identity, their arguments also made heavy use of the language of humanitarian reform. Just as some combination of humanitarian sympathy and liberal utilitarian reform was used to formulate arguments for a range of causes, from the plight of the enslaved to the condition of the imprisoned, and even to the treatment of animals, right? All of which were the subject of reform movements in this period. Such thinking was extended by these men to individuals who felt same-sex desire. This might seem an impossible political argument to make at this time, since sex between men was, of course, a nameless offense in the early 19th century, and something that almost no respectable man wanted to discuss publicly, something that might ruin a reputation for life if an individual became associated with it. And yet, in 1841, a majority in the House of Commons voted to end the death penalty for sodomy, and not through some unknown provision buried in an omnibus bill, but in a division held specifically on whether or not to keep a very short clause 4, in the 1841 punishment of death bill that eliminated the death penalty for sodomy. The majority of MPs present on that day in 1841 were willing to go on record and have their names preserved on the division list, right? Daniel O'Connell, also among them, right? Among other individuals you'll probably recognize, and have their names preserved. Now, their individual reasons for doing so were not preserved, and yet by exploring the possible influences on them in relation to this vote, it is possible to gain a better understanding of the ways in which same-sex desire might be understood publicly and privately in the early 19th century. Now, to be clear from the start, to draw attention to an early 19th century text that argues that same-sex desire could be written into a person's character from birth does not mean that I am making an argument for a timeless homosexual identity, right? As Anna Clark has argued in her analysis of the diaries of Anne Lister, individuals make sense of their desires based on the cultural texts that they have available to interpret them in conjunction with their material resources. Sexual identities, like other identities, are products of their time and place and culture and need to be understood in relation to these factors. For the purposes of what I'm presenting here today, I would only add the idea from contemporary queer theory that any statement of identity is necessarily political, and emphasize that the most explicit identity statements that I have for the early 19th century, the ones that fuse same-sex desire and the self as inseparable, they are embedded in a document that is fundamentally about politics and about creating political change within a liberal framework. Rather than this link to politics making such identity statements less valid as a way of understanding at least a small group of men in the early 19th century, it might instead draw attention to the epistemological foundations of identity claims that have been made from the late 19th century and up through into the present, and prompt us to think about the role that politics and political goals play in giving identities coherence and substance. Now, I'm going to return to these themes at the end of the talk, after first providing more of the evidence that has led me to put these arguments together in the first place. This involves constructing a narrative of the early 19th century that puts same-sex desire closer to certain political events and political actors than is currently conventional. Part of doing this involves new research and new discoveries, especially working to overcome the destruction and miscasting of evidence, both at the time and since, right, carried out by individuals who did not want themselves or their families or their organizations to be associated with such things. And part is also about recasting elements that have already been recovered, right, by the research of other scholars and activists. The standard interpretation of some of these events listed here on the slide was set 50 years ago or more, and most of these elements have only been analyzed individually, sometimes incorrectly understood, and they have not been seen as part of a broader story. While important individually, each of these events takes on greater significance when placed into their proper relationship with one another. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details of the 1822 arrest of the Bishop of Clogher for having sex with a soldier in a London public house, since I published and presented on this in other contexts, where I've argued that the political implications of this event are much greater than are usually acknowledged, and that it seems to have played a significant part in sparking the suicide only 3 weeks later, of Viscount Castlereagh. Now, still to this day, the only book investigating the possibility that Castlereagh committed suicide, right, due to being blackmailed by men accusing him of homosexual acts, is Montgomery Hyde's 1959 The Strange Death of Lord Castlereagh. Now, in it, Hyde concludes that Castlereagh did have a chance encounter with a cross-dressed man that he thought was a woman, but that this happened in public space and did not result in physical contact. Now, Hyde's level of research is impressive, yet his archival access was facilitated by the fact that he was a close friend of the Londonderry family, i.e. Castlereagh's family, and he was employed by them at the time he wrote the book as their librarian. The story of the cross-dressed prostitute comes from only one piece of evidence based on a statement by a trusted family friend, or a trusted personal friend of Castlereagh 3 decades after the suicide, and it does not fit well with Castlereagh's own statements or other evidence from the period. Castlereagh's own statements indicate that he was being blackmailed for an incident that occurred in 1819, and that he was guilty of the same crime as the Bishop of Clogher, and that he made these confessions to George IV, King George IV, right, and other members of the cabinet. Castlereagh's suicide occurred days after the end of the 1822 parliamentary session. In the next session, in 1823, Robert Peel shepherded through Parliament the Threatening Letters Act, which would provide property men greater tools to prosecute men who accuse them of unnatural crimes, addressing exactly the situation that Castlereagh found himself in. In one of the first cases to be tried under this new law, however, the wording of the Threatening Letters Act was found to be inadequate. Because of this judicial decision, Peel had to put forward an amendment to the Threatening Letters Act in the next session, and restoring his intent for the law, but by adding a clause to the legislation that dramatically increased the actions related to same-sex desire that were legally defined as infamous crime under the law. The amendment to the 1823 Act made not just sodomy itself, but any assault with intent to commit, any attempt, and every solicitation, persuasion, promise, or threat an infamous crime. And that language carries through all of the later sort of bits of legislation throughout the 19th century. Peel's speech, where he put forward the amendment to the Threatening Letters Act, was in March 1825. And shortly thereafter, there started the largest single wave of arrests for sex between men in London for the whole of the 19th century. Now, the summer of 1825 is currently not on the list of significant watersheds in the history of sexuality in Britain, but it should be. By the end of the summer of 1825, 3 members of Parliament had been brought down by scandals involving homosexual acts in the space of 5 months. One of them, MP Richard Heber, fled England for the continent in late July 1825, not 1826, like you would think from some of the stuff that's been written, on the eve of an accusation of homosexual acts being made publicly against him. Remarkably, the letters survived, showing how Robert Peel personally intervened to ensure that Heber resigned from Parliament, and how Heber and Peel corresponded through intermediaries, so Peel couldn't be directly linked to this, to make sure that Heber did not return to Britain. Another MP, James Stanhope, committed suicide in late March 1825 under suspicions of homosexual acts. A third MP, Henry Grey Bennett, radical politician involved in a lot of humanitarian liberal causes, was publicly accused in print of homosexual acts in August of 1825 and disappeared from Parliament and political life shortly thereafter. No fewer than 9 separate magistrates are recorded in the Times alone as commenting on the unusual increase in cases related to sex between men in the summer of 1825, while other magistrates can be shown to be actively cultivating these arrests. Men previously acting with impunity in their pursuit of other men were also put on trial in the summer of 1825, including my favorite, John Grosset Muirhead, brother-in-law of the Duke of Athol, and, incidentally, vice president of the Auxiliary Bible Society, who had been known in one London neighborhood for over 20 years as someone who used his economic advantage and social position to seduce men for sex. A separate raid on the Molly House was also widely publicized on the same day that the Muirhead arrest broke, although the vast majority of the reported cases in the summer of 1825 stemmed from sexual advances between 2 men in locations around the city and from the extortions based on them. So, when measured against the norms for the prosecution of homosexual behavior for the whole of the 18th and 19th century, which we can now do with confidence, and a shout out to Richter for his 18th century newspapers that he's been putting on the website in the past few years, really, very well documents 18th century material and moving into the 19th as well. It's safe to say that there is something quite unusual happening in the summer of 1825. Now, a remarkable document records the parliamentary debate where this 1825 amendment to the Threatening Letters Act was passed. It was written by an individual who, based on the evidence within the document, almost certainly was in the House of Commons at the time, who strongly identified with his feelings of same-sex desire, and who considered such feelings to be natural. And he spoke for a group of similar men. The document has been discussed by academics since 1957, known primarily to Byron scholars as the 50-page poem Don Leon. Now, because the change to the law regarding homosexual acts that Peel brought about in 1825 was forgotten by 20th century scholars and overshadowed by broader legal reforms that Peel and others did, the poem has been misdated. Scholars date the main body of the poem to 1833, with subsequent updates by others. But it is also perhaps why so little has been made about the political narrative within the poem until now. Because if you're trying to align the discussion of the poem with the specific political events of 1833, it doesn't work. And it's easily dismissed as something made up by an outsider. But all of the political actors mentioned align with the 1825 session and not later ones. And I've actually written all this up in an article called The Consequences of Dating Don Leon that was just published a couple of months ago. I can give you the citation at the end of the talk. And this also facilitates the identification of individuals alluded to in more vague terms within the poem. Now, the political narrative in the poem is of crucial importance since it was possible in the 1820s in England to eliminate the death penalty for sodomy. Legal codes throughout Europe had been revised and rationalized over the previous generations. Let's see. In Tuscany, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, sex between men was still punished with lesser penalties using other statutes in these countries, with the elimination of the death penalty for sodomy not so much a sign of greater tolerance for these acts, but an attempt to better align the severity of the punishment to the nature of the infraction. Similar appeals to the Enlightenment tradition were also used to remove the sodomy laws in France under the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Legal Code, subsequently adopted by multiple European states. A British parliamentary committee was established in 1819 to examine the use of capital punishments in relation to felonies and to report back to the House of Commons. The committee was inspired by the work of Samuel Romilly and proposed by James Mackintosh, both of whom were strong followers of the work and ideas of Jeremy Bentham, whose ideas and writings, published and unpublished, pervaded every proposal for the reform of the legal code and so many other areas, with the first new legal code reform legislation put forward in 1827. Now, it wouldn't have been possible to stand on the floor of the House of Commons in this period and speak for the injustice of the sodomy law. When the laws relating to sex between men were discussed in the British Parliament in the 19th century, they were almost always paired with another piece of legislation so that any debate could be presented as related to the other issue. But it might have been possible, by lobbying from inside the unreformed Parliament, to have the death penalty for sodomy quietly dropped as a punishment, as part of a larger criminal law reform. And Don Leon records one document that argued for just such a reform. Now, that document doesn't survive, but fragments of evidence related to it are preserved in Don Leon and one other source. It's titled A Free Examination into the Penal Statutes 25 Henry VIII and 5 Elizabeth, i.e. the sodomy laws, and it is addressed to both houses of Parliament. The fragments that we have indicate that its contents were similar to Jeremy Bentham's unpublished arguments against the sodomy laws, written in 1774, 1785, and 1814 to 1816. They also preserve evidence that the work was written and endorsed by a collective of individuals. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to run through all of the specific arguments of the work, right? Many, you can probably infer them, standard utilitarian Enlightenment arguments against. More interesting, right? If evidence of a free examination in Don Leon is only fragmentary, the poem itself records in its entirety an early 19th century journey of self-discovery related to sexuality and involving same-sex desire. In the account, the author repeatedly refers to what he describes as inborn passions and his love for other men. When narrating his childhood, the author states that he was attracted to beauty of both sexes in his early teens, and that he remained that way as a man. He would feel strongly for other boys, but did not act on those feelings and remained innocent. He could not explain these feelings then, and although he and another boy might lay together, little else happened on these occasions. The author also presents the idea that these teenage feelings were already set in his character, but hidden, as if written in sympathetic ink, which means invisible ink, only becoming intelligible with time and experience. And just a quote from the poem, right? Thus passed my boyhood, and though proofs were none, what path my future course would run. Like sympathetic ink, if then unclear, the test applied soon made the trace appear. And probably sympathetic ink is going to be the title for the book, right? Just because it's such a great phrase. It is significant that all of these youthful experiences were presented as with individuals of roughly his own age. While at university, he became infatuated with several slightly younger men, one in particular who was of a lesser class background. He was aware of the laws against such passions and began reading to find justifications for his love. The author later discovered the poets and philosophers of the ancient world, including Plato, Socrates, Bion of Smyrna, Plutarch, and Horace, among others. The Don Leon poet ends this section by arguing that human nature is the same then as now, and cites Shakespeare's sonnets, among other texts, as evidence for the persistence of same-sex desire among the learned Englishmen of the Christian era. The author's argument is not that he is exclusively homosexual, though, but it is the strict embargo on these feelings that warps us. And he continues on to say that God gives every man at birth a stamp, and then lists the many men who have had such feelings similar to his. But the argument for tolerance and recognition was also mixed with passionate indignation over Robert Peel's change to the law in 1825. Right? The poet writes, O Peel, for this nefarious deed alone, do what thou wilt, thou never can atone. Why blow the bubble of thy own repute for laws amended, but on this be mute? Mute? No, not mute, for heretofore there lay a stumbling block in every jury's way. But, Draco-like, thou, gainsay who can, did add the clause to sink the drowning man. Why were the listening commons silent then? Martin has mercy, yes, for beasts, not men. And Brogden, his modesty, his voice impedes, when the sections of the bill he reads, with furs of Connie's to gentle hush, subdues his tone and feigns a maiden blush. But answer Mackintosh, wert thou asleep, or was the tide of thy feeling at its neap? Now, here the poet is chastising members of Parliament known for championing humanitarian causes for not arguing against Peel's successful effort to add the clause to sink the drowning man in 1825. The text of the poem lays out a rational case for the abolition of the death penalty for sodomy and describes the ideal type of person for whom such a reform of the law ought to be enacted. Although it was first written as the result of a lost battle in 1825, it was in the 1830s that it was expanded, elaborated, circulated, and seemed once again to engage with the parliamentary debate. Now, the political events of the 1830s greatly increased the chances for reform of the sodomy law. In 1830, for the first time in 2 generations, the Whigs came to power with a mandate to carry out a range of reforms that had been discussed but deferred for decades. The size of the Whig liberal majority returned under the new post-1832 franchise facilitated the government's ability to carry out such humanitarian reform, symbolically beginning their work with the abolition of slavery. And some of you may know, right, this is the image of that parliament. These are actually portraits of everyone in that post-1832 parliament, recording that moment, right, because they were very conscious of it being something quite significant. It went on from there to pass factory regulation reform, municipal government reform, poor law reform, prison reform, and a host of other reforms, both successful and not, in a period still sometimes referred to as the Age of Reform. All aspects of how the state conducted its business were under review, and one of these areas was the use of the death penalty in the criminal law. In the 1820s, Peel had only been able to pass consolidation legislation for the legal code. He had not succeeded in altering punishments for crimes. The Whigs, however, were not so constrained by ideology to respect the inherited tradition, and they were open to significantly altering the legal code. Many Whigs sought a more rational relationship between punishments and the severity of the crime, and a more systematic and rational criminal code. To this end, Lord Brougham, Lord Chancellor in Earl Grey's ministry, and a friend and intellectual disciple of Jeremy Bentham, initiated the Royal Commission on the Criminal Law, appointed to study the problem and to make specific recommendations for changes. The commission was made up of 5 committed legal authorities and published 8 reports between 1833 and 1845, with the final report being a template for the codification of the English criminal law. While it was not adopted as a whole, many of the Commission's recommendations were passed as legislation, especially as they related to the use of the death penalty. While all 5 members of the Royal Commission were strongly committed to the Benthamite legal principles, John Austin, one of the individuals, is particularly interesting for my study. Austin was a noted British legal theorist, and he had argued throughout his career that there were no necessary connections between the law and morality. Human legal systems, he claimed, can and should be constructed in an empirical and value-free way. Austin's personal friendship with Jeremy Bentham was also the closest of any of the 5 commission members. They were neighbors in Queen Square Place for many years, and it was largely through Bentham's influence that Austin had been appointed professor of jurisprudence at the newly founded University of London in 1826. An Austin biographer has argued that Bentham probably had a heavier impact on Austin's ethical and legal philosophy more so than any other person. Now, endnote updates to Don Leon were made while the Royal Commission was conducting its work, and at least those that are datable by the ephemeral newspaper stories they quote coincide with the formation of the Royal Commission in 1833, the release of the Commission's special report on the use of the death penalty in 1836 and the flurry of legislation that followed, and then the bill that was finally put forward to eliminate the death penalty for sodomy in 1841. Now, taken as a whole, the notes more than doubled the size of the original poem, and they added more evidence supporting arguments for the abolition of the death penalty for sodomy. Another source indicates that at least one of the editions of A Free Examination was published in 1833, when the Royal Commission on the Criminal Law started its work. The poem itself is expanded by over 1/3 at some point after 1833, again with information that seemed to come from someone within the Parliament. The protracted decade-long work of the Royal Commission gave the individuals revising Don Leon multiple chances to try and influence the reform process. Given these circumstances, to end the death penalty for sodomy would require 5 committed followers of Bentham to make such a recommendation, as well as a majority of parliamentarians not to object as it passed through as part of larger legislation. It would be a reform that Bentham had systematically shown in his own writing to be consistent with his ideas and principles, including his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, published in 1789, which actually does make an argument for this, right, in his mainstream work. It's not just in the privately circulated stuff. And we know now that sexual freedom and sexual self-expression were important to the thinking of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's central aim in utilitarian ethics, the maximization of pleasure, extended to the consumption of worldly goods and the experiences of physical pleasure. Bentham returned to this topic of sexual pleasure from the 1770s through the 1820s. We have also known for quite some time that Bentham had written extensively against the sodomy laws, again first in the 1770s, and then he returned to this in the early 19th century. A portion of Bentham's work on sexuality, the first volume of Not Paul But Jesus, was published under a pseudonym in 1823, in which Bentham worked to demonstrate that the denial of physical pleasure was not a part of the teaching of Jesus, right? That this was added later by Paul, i.e. not Paul but Jesus, or therefore not Paul but Jesus. Lord John Russell, Home Secretary for most of the mid and later 1830s, was responsible for many of the bills that eliminated the death penalty on a range of crimes, was also strongly influenced by Bentham. Russell had specifically given the Royal Commission a mandate to examine the use of the death penalty across the criminal code and to reduce and rationalize its use. Now, while I cannot yet say if these individuals were shown Bentham's arguments on sexuality or homosexuality, same-sex desire, we know that Bentham shared his writings on sexuality privately with individuals that included William Godwin, Francis Place, and James Mill, and that he had hoped that sharing these ideas privately might eventually make it possible to have them more publicly discussed and accepted. The Royal Commission established principles and arguments that could allow for the death penalty for sodomy, and a provision to this effect was put in the 1841 punishment of death draft legislation. It passed the Commons, as I mentioned at the start of the talk. The unnatural crimes and rape section of the bill was debated in the Commons in a separate division. It passed with 123 ayes, only 61 noes. But then, in the final reading in the House of the Lords, someone singled it out, the sodomy provision, and spoke against it. Right? Hansard records that it was the Earl of Winchelsea who was responsible for this, and that, quote, he implored their lordships not to withdraw the punishment of death from a crime so utterly abhorrent to the feelings of human nature, close quote. Their lordships, he was convinced, would do a great violence to the moral feelings of a very large class of the community if they exempted this crime from the punishment of death. The Home Secretary, no longer Lord John Russell, but the Marquis of Normanby, was recorded as saying that only that, quote, he was glad that the noble Earl had proposed his amendment with such brevity, because one of the worst things that their lordships could do would be to enter on a discussion of an amendment of this kind, close quote. No one was willing to argue against the Earl of Winchelsea, and his amendment was accepted without a division, and thus the sodomy law stood as it was, and sodomy remained a capital crime in Britain. Now, this, I think, is a telling moment. The end of the death penalty for sodomy was something that could have happened in the early 19th century in Britain. Liberal reformers could support it and see it as one of a range of liberal reforms that included prison reform, the abolition of slavery, franchise reform, and the prevention of cruelty to animals, and a host of other popular causes in the era. No one was willing to speak for it publicly, but many could be convinced to support it quietly. And it wasn't just anyone who stepped in to kill this type of reform. The Earl of Winchelsea had violently opposed almost every liberal measure that was brought forward in the House of Lords. He was an especially strong defender of evangelical Protestant positions and gave some of the most passionate and frequent denunciations of Daniel O'Connell and any move towards Catholic emancipation within the political system. He was one of the few English aristocrats to identify himself with the Orange Party in Ireland, and he was most known at the time for fighting a duel with the Duke of Wellington, while the Duke of Wellington was still Prime Minister, over Wellington's role for bringing about Catholic emancipation. Wellington, by contrast, I've been able to find, provided character witnesses for two men charged with soliciting sex for other men, one of whom was his longtime friend and MP, William Banks, who was one of the individuals mentioned multiple times in Don Leon and involved, I believe, in the later updates that were made to that work in the 1830s and 40s. Banks's arrests for soliciting sex between men occurred in 1833 and 1841, dates that line perhaps too well with the political events that I've just been talking about to be entirely coincidental, but I'm still investigating that part of the story. Now, if in the end the effort to end the death penalty for sodomy was unsuccessful, these events still, nevertheless, provide valuable insights and correctives to our understandings of the period. Up until now, we've let the opinions of someone like the Earl of Winchelsea or the publishers of the inflammatory texts like the Phoenix of Sodom be the lens through which we've understood early 19th century attitudes towards sex between men. This worst of crimes rhetoric has dominated, and it has drowned out more everyday evidence, right? Like this from a Hogarth, right? You know, one of the most popular artists of the period, right? These individuals, right? This is an adulterous affair, and above is a painting of Jupiter and Io signaling that. But at least as prominent when the picture is over here, right? This is Zeus and Ganymede. And here you have this man with the bird-like hook nose hovering over the effeminate sort of man who's appreciating the music, right? Same-sex desire, part of the scene, part of the, or here, right? Or as a joke, right? This is a humorous print, right? Sort of making fun of a meeting of connoisseurs, right? These men making a classical nude, you know, out of a life model, right? And yet, if we notice their postures, right, their hats with the open end facing out, right, sort of, I don't know, immodest postures, sort of doing sort of things with the end of canes, right? I mean, the whole idea is that it's sort of critiquing, right, a supposedly aesthetic, but really, you know, what they're doing isn't so high-minded as what they're pretending it to be, right? And this was circulated. Some images are more obvious, right, where same-sex desire was circulated. And of course, I have a shout out as well to Dominic's work, right? This is an image that I think that what you're doing in your latest work is really playing into this really well. Supporting this argument is the most recent work by Dominic James, who has used the ambiguity found in caricature as a source to explore just how queer the imagery associated with the macaroni, the dandy, the esti could be, right, from the mid-18th century up until the time of Oscar Wilde. By not seeking to argue what identity or sexuality was signaled in such imagery, James is free to show us a world where same-sex desire seems strongly implied, right, such as this image, as James describes in his book, right? What we're literally shown is one man standing between the splayed-out legs of another, administering something that looks rather phallic to him, right? To paraphrase what you say in your book. Such an image, right? And then another one also too, right? The sort of gender bending that seems to be going on with the alignment here, right? And these are Crookshanks, right? Widely circulated. Also supporting this idea, I think, is the work of Harry Cox on the Warrington Gang of 1806, where he uncovered evidence with the ease with which working class men might find connections for sex in places such as the Royal Exchange in Manchester, and the methods that local elites used to meet up with men of both equal or lesser class backgrounds to make connections for sex. To be sure, the evidence that Cox found was preserved because some men did strongly object to those practices, but the world that Cox shows us seems more to indicate that state terror and revulsion were exceptional intrusions rather than, you know, the norm, at least in some men's experiences. I think it's time to see someone more like the Duke of Wellington as the default, right? Or better yet, the 123-man majority in the House of Commons in 1841 who did not object to the softening of penalties in this area, so long as it could be done quietly and it could be done in a way that allowed them to see such reforms as in the continuum of liberal reforms. It's the same way we got rid of the sodomy laws in the United States in the 1970s, rewriting the state constitutions, you know, that just happened to drop the sodomy law as a part of that process, right? And part of making that argument for liberal reform, I think, By the way, this is Banks at about this time, right? The before was a picture from him in his youth. That's about how he looked, in this later period. Now, and part of making that liberal argument for reform, I think, is why we get one of the strongest statements for inborn and natural sexual identity from this period preserved within a text that is primarily a call for political change. Now, that is because liberal political change and liberal political theory, from Hobbes to Locke to Rousseau to Wollstonecraft, I would argue even Freud could be in there as well too, always couples its theory of the state, right, its plan for the overall government, with a theory of the type of individual necessary to make that state function, right? Contract theory, you've got to have a certain type of person that can hold a contract. It's often education that's the key to make a citizen out of a subject. And I would argue that this is why the political argument against the death penalty for sodomy in Don Leon is coupled with a narrative of inborn same-sex desire. It is an argument for liberal inclusion which necessitates a type of individual worthy of inclusion. The law, and hence the state, could not be changed for a man who felt same-sex desire because he refused to control his passions, right? The going understanding of what might cause such behavior at the time. But it might be changed for the man who felt these passions because he was born that way. The confrontation with the state over the need to change the law created the need to articulate a certain type of subjectivity, and, therefore, finding this sort of identity statement doesn't really contradict what Foucault said about identity formation. Rather, it aligns with it quite well. It's just we made a fetish of that late 19th century moment. Social construction happens, multiple times, multiple places, different texts, different outcomes, but similar process. So, in many ways, what I've presented here today are two stories, with many of the ways in which they fit together or not remaining elusive. One shows well-known figures from British political history involved in issues related to same-sex desire in unexpected ways, culminating in the effort to end the death penalty for sodomy following Benthamite logic of rational reform. And the other is about the creation of a passionate, private denunciation of injustice, poetic, wild, elusive, sensual, that is also focused on ending the death penalty for sodomy. I can demonstrate in a range of ways that both of these narratives developed in parallel, and they come tantalizingly close to intersecting at key points, and with certain individuals in the 1820s, 30s, and early 1840s. The poem Don Leon is closer to the politics of the time than previously thought, just as the individuals driving criminal law reform might have thought differently about same-sex desire, either through personal connections or philosophical influences than previously assumed. Even if it does not prove possible to bring these two worlds any closer together than this, I think we understand them both a good deal better by making the attempt to hold them both in mind at the same time. Thank you.